Welcome to Sherlock Tales, where every mystery comes alive. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, give this video a like, and share it with your fellow mystery lovers. Tell us in the comments, which part of the world are you watching from? Let's solve mysteries together.
Dr. Watson would later observe, quietly and with no small wonder, that London's fog seemed to choose its mysteries with an artist's partiality. On the morning that began the affair of the roses that would not die, it sketched the city in charcoal and pearl, then set a single bright touch upon Baker Street, a crimson bloom pinned to the lapel of an anxious gentleman who stood at our hearth like a figure cut from frost. The gentleman announced himself as Mr. Peregrine Vale of Chiswick, a man of fashionable charities, and the sort of nervous prosperity that wears its watch chain too brashly. Inspector Lestrade had sent him. This much he confessed at once, hat twisting in his hands, yet Vale was plainly torn between relief at having crossed our threshold and dread of the scrutiny that waited there. Holmes did not rise. He regarded the visitor from the settee, steepling his long fingers beneath his chin, the grey gaze sharpening as it passed from the man's scuffed shoes to the clean-shaven jaw, lingered upon a petal clinging to the cuff, and came to rest curiously on the bloom at his lapel. "You have come about a flower," Holmes said. Vale started. "A garden, sir." "Just so," Holmes murmured. "Pray sit." Watson, he who knew Holmes best, felt the faintest stirring of that speculative electricity which presaged a severe problem. For all that our practice brought us the city's sorrows, it was not often that a man carried them so literally upon his person. The rose at Vale's lapel was a lush, deep red, the sort of opulent colour one finds in oil paint rather than in November. Yet it had not wilted in the coal-smudged air. Its skin shone as though newly cut. When Vale placed his hat upon his knee, a second petal, crisp as lacquer, fell and drifted to the carpet like a flake of enamel. Lestrade's card, smudged with haste, spoke of peculiar circumstances and no visible agency. It was the Yard's music hall refrain, but Holmes's face wore the stillness of a man who hears a more intricate melody beneath the tune. "Mr. Vale," said Holmes, "what has happened?" "It is Lady Charlotte Whitfield," Vale replied. "Dead, Mr. Holmes, dead in her walled garden at Greengage House, and if you will forgive me, there is something abominable in the manner of it." "Abominable?" Watson prompted, moved less by curiosity than by the quiet despair in the man's voice. "The roses," Vale said, They don't die." He pronounced the word with the awkwardness of any sensible fellow forced to speak the language of superstition. Vale, it emerged, served as trustee for the charitable estate of the late Sir Lionel Whitfield, whose widow, Lady Charlotte, had for years cultivated a famous garden behind high brick walls on the riverward side of Chiswick. By every account, those roses were her world. Greengage House hosted fêtes where journalists wrote with rapture of perpetual bloom, though the sensible attributed it to clever pruning, glass frames, and the money to heat outbuildings through the winter. "Her ladyship guarded the methods jealously," Vale went on. "There was a gardener once, a Mr. Pike, dismissed without character for curiosity. That is the word she used. And last night, Mr. Holmes, we held a small musical evening. When the guests had gone, Lady Charlotte took a turn in the garden. Her maid says she did so nightly. The wall gate was locked as always. No one heard a cry. This morning she was found on the gravel path, a most peaceful expression, as if in sleep. And all about her," he broke off and looked at the rose upon his lapel with a sort of disgust. "Bloom in this weather. The beds are full as June." "Cause?" Holmes asked. The surgeon ventured heart failure. "There is no mark, no sign at all." "And yet—" Vale's breathing thickened. "Yet there was an odour, Dr. Watson, pardon, an odour I cannot describe. Not decay, not the garden, something like new varnish, a sweetness that does not belong out of doors." Holmes's eyes half closed. "You brought the rose from the garden?" "Yes, I thought, foolishly perhaps, that you would wish to see what I mean." He touched the petal again. It gave beneath his finger with a faint resistance, as a wax seal does. "I should like to see the place itself," Holmes said. "At once." Vale's relief was immediate and unfeigned, though a shadow remained as of a man who fears the very success of his errand. He gave us a few further facts while I rang for my coat. The garden's walls run high enough that even a nimble boy would balk at the climb. The only ingress is from the conservatory doors, which were found locked from within, and the wall gate, which the head housemaid secured herself at night. The key to the gate hangs in Lady Charlotte's morning room. It was there after the body was discovered, as always. The gravel showed only Lady Charlotte's own slipper prints and, faintly, the marks of a broom drawn days before along the path's edge. There had been no rain since Wednesday, though the world wore the damp pallor of it. We went out into that pallor, Holmes, with the sudden energy that comes to him like a brace of cold air upon the lungs. The cab rattled west through a city of blurred lamps and dull river light, and Mr. Vale, warmed by our attention, supplied what particulars he could. He spoke of the widow's charities and of his duty as executor, of whispers, malicious, he insisted, that Lady Charlotte's garden was maintained by chemical trickery rather than horticultural genius. Of a neighbour, Mr. Alfred Merryweather, who had once sued over encroaching roots and lost the case with poor Grace. Of Lady Charlotte's niece and heir, Miss Eleanor Whitfield, who had returned from Vienna 6 weeks earlier and now walked the house like a figure out of morning glass. Holmes listened, head bowed, as one marking the play of shadows rather than the objects that cast them. "You said the odour was like varnish," he remarked at last. "Was it strongest near the conservatory?" I could not say. "You do not smoke," Holmes added, as though reading a heading from a ledger. "No," said Vale, startled. "I never acquired the taste. Yet you will forgive me that your hat speaks of an evening spent among smokers. A moist smudge upon the felt rim, and here a fleck of ash, Turkish blend. Not yours, then." Vale glanced at the hat with the ruefulness of a man confronted by his wardrobe's indiscretions. "There were gentlemen present last night who prefer stronger tobacco." "Indeed," Holmes murmured. "Lestrade will have given his opinion?" Vale coloured. He thinks that an elderly lady who spends her nights in the cold will sometimes die in her garden." "He is not wrong. Only I beg you to come and see, Mr. Holmes. There is something unwholesome there." Greengage House rose from the river fog with an air of respectable melancholy. Brick, ivy-draped, the sort of Georgian comfort that looks surprised to find itself in a world of railways. The housemaid, a competent woman with an offended mouth, admitted us with the stiff solicitude that belongs to tragedy and London gentlemen. We were shown first to a morning room that smelt faintly of lavender and coal smoke. On a ribboned hook by the writing desk hung a tarnished key. A fine dust had settled upon the desk leather. In it were 2 faint furrows where a key had lately lain and been lifted. Holmes glanced once and said nothing. He asked to be taken to the conservatory. The glass house was warm as breath and dripping, with its own miniature weather. Leaves trembled with condensed mist. Beyond its far doors the garden lay, a deep, impossible theatre of colour. We stepped out as men might pass from winter into a painted summer. Watson, who, like any medical man, trusts nature to her seasons, felt his skin prickle. Beds ran, in disciplined ranks, stakes and arches and disciplined green, but the blossom, rich pompons and satiny goblets, crimsons and creams, apricots and sulphur yellow, all unfurled as though every rose had been granted its first morning at once. Yet there was no insect hum. A silence lay upon that wealth, a chapel hush, curiously breathless. "Do you perceive it, Watson?" Holmes said softly. "The sweetness," Watson answered. It hovered at the edges of the air, an artificial grace note. Not garden, not fruit, but something of shop fronts and cabinet makers, a polish that clung faintly to the tongue. "Shellac," he ventured, and then doubted himself. "No, perhaps a resin." Holmes stooped to the nearest bloom, did not touch it, and smiled his thin, wintry smile. "A rose that refuses to die," he murmured. "How convenient for a legend." Vale drew in a shaking breath. "She lay there," he said, pointing to a gentle curve of gravel path between 2 beds. The housemaid had had the presence of mind to cover the spot with a clean cloth. Holmes lifted the corner and studied the ground with a gaze that, to those who do not know him, can seem insulting in its indifference to grief. He noted the print of a small slipper, the faint sliding correction at the heel, as if the foot had met loose stones. He noted, too, that where a body's weight had pressed upon the path, The gravel did not sink as deeply as one expects when the soil is damp. "Dry beneath," he said, as if to himself. He tapped the cane he had brought against the border edge and watched dust rise. He turned then to the wall gate, stout oak, an iron hasp bright with recent polishing. The keyhole showed a minuscule crescent of dark on its lower lip. Holmes touched it with the end of a folded handkerchief, preserving whatever record the brass had kept, and brought the cloth to his nose. His face betrayed nothing. From the conservatory side, the door bolts were shot. On the inner sill, Watson's eye caught a scatter of pale grit, unlike garden soil, finer, whiter, as though a pocket of chalk had been shaken out. Holmes bent to it at once. "Lime," he said, "not used by every gardener, and certainly not here where the soil is already sweet." He held the grit against the glass. It left no scratch. A low shape crouched at the border, a gardener's pail of copper, water beaded upon its lip. Holmes tipped it gently. The water was clear and smelt faintly of the same treacly note. "Mr. Vale," Holmes said without looking up, "who has charge of this garden now that Mr. Pike is gone?" "A man named Creer," Vale answered. "Hired from Kew last spring. He keeps the keys to the tool house and the potting shed, but not to the wall gate." That he nodded toward the ribboned hook in the morning room, as if the key could hear and refute him. Holmes's eyes drifted along the brickwork of the wall. The mortared courses were even, unhelpful. Yet the corner nearest the river bore, just at shoulder height, a faint smear darker than its fellows. "The ladder rested here within the week," he observed, "but no marks on the coping. Therefore not yesterday. The wall was not a party to last night's business." He took up the rose from Vale's lapel at last, turning it between long fingers. "Exquisite," he said, "and very much alive to the eye, but to the touch." He brushed the pad of his thumb along the outermost petal, and showed us, if indeed he meant us to notice, a whisper of dullness upon his skin, as though he had touched candle grease and powdered sugar together. Watson felt the old sensation, half unease, half admiration, as if he stood in a church while a clever skeptic named the saints. "Holmes," he began. "In due course," Holmes said, and that gentle tyranny that Watson knew too well settled over the party. He moved then with that peculiar erratic focus, which was not agitation but a kind of mental triangulation, to the potting bench, where a row of labels, recently written in a cramped hand, read Madame Plantier, Prince Camille, and Eternal Red, to the shed door, whose brass plate bore, even in the weak light, the diagonal run of an oiled rag, to a pair of felt-soled overshoes hung on a peg, curious in a garden, though not in a conservatory, where gravel scratches glass. Lestrade would have called it a peaceful death among her flowers, and been done. But the air was too sweet, the roses too handsome, the key too carefully where it ought to be. Above all, that silence, no bees, no thorn-scratch, no true breath of earth. The scene, Watson thought, was like a theatre set struck an hour too early, all the props exact, and something human suspiciously absent. Holmes straightened. "Mr. Vale," he said, "you have done wisely in coming. Your Lady Charlotte has not been murdered, as the penny papers understand murder, but she has been helped to her end, and more than once." "More than once?" Vale whispered. Holmes looked at the hundreds of patient, impossible blooms and smiled without mirth. "A garden that denies decay is an excellent place to study how nature may be compelled to err. We shall require a list of your guests last night, a word with your gardener, and 5 minutes in Lady Charlotte's morning room alone." "And the roses?" Watson asked. Holmes let the stolen bloom fall. It struck the gravel with the faintest tap. No soft collapse, no living sigh. "They will keep," he said. "They always do." Holmes did not wait upon our faltering amazement. He turned from the fallen bloom as if from a conversational nicety, and asked that he be shown again to the morning room. Vale led the way back through the tiled passage, the glass-house warmth condensing upon our hats and shoulders, before the house swallowed it in the plain odor of coal and polish. The key still hung upon its ribbon by the desk, demure and eminently correct. Holmes did not touch it at once. He stood a little apart, saw the room entire, then crossed, bent, and studied the leather with that practiced stillness of his, which is more eloquent than any rhapsody of praise. "You perceive, Watson, how the dust falls here in a uniform bloom. See the smooth gutters where the key has lain a length of days, and here, the faint crescent freshened in the last hours." He did not look up as he spoke. Yet Vale's breath caught as a man's will when a conjurer finds the coin he thought secreted. Holmes drew from his pocketbook a thin slip of untreated card and slid it under the ribbon's knot, lifting the key so that it swung against his finger like a pendant. He inclined it to the light. A small gleam, colorless yet greasy, clung at the bow's inner curve. He smelt it quickly, the breath no more than a moth's flutter, and his face resumed its habitual economy. A varnish very lightly applied, he said. Or a polish meant for delicate things, stringed instruments perhaps. Have you musicians among your circle, Mr. Vale? We had last evening, replied our client. A pianist, Miss Sophia Ardenti, staying with friends in Hammersmith. A violinist, Mr. Felix Brack, late of the Gayvand House. Lady Charlotte admired his fire, if not his manners. And a singer, Miss Trevis. Mr. Merriweather attended as neighbour. My wife, Lady Charlotte's niece, Miss Eleanor, and the curate of St. Anselm's. Creer looked in only at the end to ask if he should bank the fires in the conservatory. He is not one of us. Holmes lowered the key, let it kiss the leather, and straightened his cuffs. I should like the names neatly written. Later we shall have specimens of the hand of each. For the present, call your gardener. We found Creer in the potting shed, a long, awkward man with the careful cleanliness of a hospital orderly, his nails pale from frequent brushings, his boots lined with the fine chalk I had seen by the conservatory sill. He stood with the docility of a respectable man facing authority, and held his hat precisely at the hips in the manner of Q-trained men the world over. Holmes asked little and at odd angles. What soil Lady Charlotte preferred for new grafts? Whether lime was used to sweeten the beds? What fluid stood in the copper pail? Creer answered without ornament. The soil needed no lime, sir. The pail held plain water left from washing the steaks. The roses were fed by a tonic made up in the still room, according to her ladyship's own notes. Glycerin, a little gum, a drop of oil of spike to keep off mould, and in winter, a wash lately adopted for the buds, a preparation of his own devising, harmless as milk to keep the frost from biting. He looked at that moment not at Holmes but into the middle distance, and his mouth tightened as though he heard again a criticism, and held his peace by force of discipline. Harmless as milk, Holmes repeated, and the words hung in the air like the steam of a horse's breath. He walked past Creer and examined the rack of labels. Your hand? He asked, indicating the cramped script I had noticed before. No, sir. Her ladyship wrote those. She took pride in names. Creer's eyes went to a blank space on the rail where a label had recently hung. The nail was bright, the dust bruised aside. We've a variety new from France that she called Eternal Red, because it wouldn't brown as others do. The label's gone. I thought it mislaid. Holmes's gaze made a quick dart, hawk-like, to the small galvanized bin beneath the bench. He lifted its lid with the end of his cane, and I saw at the bottom a melted gobbet of wax dotted with grit, as though a label's head had been pressed into it and then discarded. He left it undisturbed. Tell me of last night. Creer's account agreed in its bones with Vale's, firelight and small applause, her ladyship's customary turn along the paths, his own appearance at the conservatory door to ask if he might bank the stove, for the temperature held too high with so many guests. He had not entered the garden. He had shut the iron vents at 11:30 and gone home by the riverway, the moon low and a thin mist coming on. He did not smoke Turkish tobacco, he said, when Holmes's eye strayed to the neat packet in his breast. He had given it up altogether to steady his hand. He had not returned before morning. When he had been dismissed, Holmes remained in the doorway a moment, balancing on the heel as he does when choosing where to place the next stone in a crossing. Then, with another of those abrupt movements, which are not abrupt to the mind that makes them, he asked for the writing with names and retired to the morning-room with it, as a general might carry a sketched map off to a candle. I followed at a distance and stood by the window, watching the fog take and return the lawn. Holmes opened the desk's shallow drawers with no more force than a whisper. Here were letters in a neat, ungenerous hand, Lady Charlotte's petitions from charities, a tradesman's bill for winter fuel, a pamphlet on the virtues of collodion, in floral preservation marked with crossings and improvements, and a thin blue envelope with a foreign stamp crushed to the corner. He held the last to the glass. Vienna, I read. The paper within proved to be a courteous note in German, thanking Lady Charlotte for her patronage of the firm, and listing an order, tincture of digitalis, Oil of spike, gum mastic, and a small quantity, underlined twice of Blausäure. Holmes's face even then did not change. He slid the paper back with the practiced discretion that saves men reputations until the rope comes out. "You will observe, Watson," he said without turning, "that her ladyship, though a gardener by sentiment, was a chemist by method. That is not a crime. The Yard too often confuses knowledge with guilt." He drew up short. "There is the bell. Let us have the niece." Miss Eleanor Whitfield entered as one too composed to be at ease. She was dark where her aunt had been fair in her portraits, her dress a severe black that neither sought nor rejected pity. The face had something of the academies about it, a mind fastened by habit to abstraction, as if rooms and people existed on the periphery of a study. Holmes, who can be tender with sorrow when it meets him honestly, was unyielding now. He asked after her movements, her aunt's health, her opinion of Creer, of Mr. Merryweather, and of the society her aunt kept. Eleanor answered with the exactness of one long accustomed to a catechism. "I was in Vienna until 6 weeks ago. Mr. Holmes. My aunt's heart had troubled her of late, but she would not be managed. Mr. Creer is diligent and unassuming. Mr. Merryweather is not unintelligent, but prides himself upon it. As to last night, I retired at 11:30 and heard nothing. The key, I believe, hangs in here as it always has." She glanced at the ribboned hook with the faintest flinch, as though the knowledge had a taste. Holmes's eyes softened a fraction. "You play a little piano," she said, and after a fractional beat the violin poorly. "I do not perform. Your tutors in Vienna were musical, no doubt." Her mouth made the smallest refusal of a smile. "My tutors were physicians. I study medicine as far as the city will have me." Holmes bowed and let her go. When the door had closed, he turned upon me with the air of a man who has set 2 points upon his invisible chart. "There are 2 hands here, Watson, each confident enough to mistake cunning for subtlety. One keeps a key conspicuously where it ought to be, while making sure it has lately been elsewhere. The other fills a garden with beauty so carefully tended that nature herself is shut out, silence and sweetness being the only witnesses they trust. Between them, an old lady dies without a bruise. You think the gate was opened and closed again," I said, "and the conservatory used to secure the alibi? I think the gate has become a character in the play. The audience's eyes will go to it whenever the stage is crowded. Meanwhile, the stagehand works at the wings." He glanced toward the conservatory, where the impossible June waited without bees. "We will now speak with Mr. Merryweather and with Mr. Brack. After that, we shall ask Lestrade for the surgeon's notes. And tonight, if the fog holds, we shall pay a call upon the garden when it believes itself unobserved." He took up the list of names Vale had written, tucked it with an almost affectionate pat into his pocketbook, and moved off through the corridor. The housemaid, hearing us, stepped back into shadow with her cloth. I saw her eyes go to the key and back again. It was a small thing, and may have been no more than a servant's fear of blame. Yet Holmes's head, without pausing, inclined a hair's breadth, as though he had seen the same glimmer upon the surface of our little world and marked it for later use. Holmes had a way of treating every house as though it were a patient whose pulse he might take and whose indiscretions he might coax into speech. At Greengage House he carried himself with that precise economy of motion which signified that he was listening not only to words but to the timbre beneath them. He had demanded Vale summon Mr. Merryweather and the violinist, Mr. Felix Brack, and in the meantime the household remained under a strained hush, the servant speaking in half tones as if the roses themselves might overhear. Merryweather entered first, a florid gentleman with the look of one who takes too much pride in having once lost a case. His gait was defiant, though his eyes betrayed unease. He acknowledged Vale and myself with grudging courtesy, but his glance at Holmes was a mixture of suspicion and reluctant awe. Holmes offered him no greeting, only gestured to a chair as though seating a witness. "You were present last evening," Holmes began at once. "At what hour did you depart?" "A trifle after midnight," said Merryweather. "Lady Charlotte herself urged me to linger, though my opinion of her roses is plain. It is not nature's work when winter beds wear June's colours." "You have said as much before," Holmes murmured. "I recall a dispute regarding encroaching roots." Merryweather shifted. "Old quarrels, sir, but yes, she cultivated a jungle where others must contend with boundaries. I cannot deny resentment, though I would never," his throat tightened, "never wish her harm." Holmes leaned forward a fraction. And yet you lingered late despite a quarrel, a shrug. Curiosity, Mr. Holmes. Who would not be curious to see how far she would stretch her artifice? Holmes's eyes flicked to the man's hands, broad-fingered and stained faintly with what might have been soil or ink. Do you smoke, Mr. Merriweather? On occasion, yes. A cheap Turkish blend, though I keep it for outdoor walks. My wife cannot abide the odor. Holmes inclined his head almost imperceptibly, as though a note had been struck on the instrument he had expected. That will be all for the moment. Merriweather bristled, half inclined to defend himself further, then thought better of it and withdrew. Holmes remained motionless until the sound of his footsteps died. Then he called for Mr. Brack. The violinist appeared with the restless bearing of a man whose nerves are tuned half a tone too high. His manner was sharp, his dark hair dishevelled, and his accent carried the faintest foreign burr. He bowed perfunctorily, eyes darting about the morning room as though appraising its worth. You played for Lady Charlotte last evening, Holmes said. With fire, Mr. Brack replied with a smile meant for admiration, but finding none. She demanded passion, and I gave it. What hour did you leave? I left when others did, close to midnight. Miss Ardenti walked with me part way to the road. We parted, she to her lodgings, I to mine. Holmes regarded him as a falcon regards a bird whose feathers flutter too freely. You tune your instrument with varnish. Brack's eyes narrowed. My Stradivarius requires care. Oil of spike, mastic. These things preserve the voice. Holmes's voice softened dangerously. And a trace of Blausora, perhaps, to preserve the silence. Brack started visibly, then laughed too loudly. You jest, Mr. Holmes. No musician poisons his instrument. Holmes made no reply, only let the silence linger until Brack fidgeted beneath it. At last he dismissed him with a wave, and the man withdrew, leaving the faint tang of resin behind him. When we were alone again, Vale shifted in unease. Holmes, do you suspect either? I suspect neither alone, Holmes said. But listen, Watson. We have a key too well displayed, a garden too well preserved, and two gentlemen whose habits provide both the means and the odor. Merriweather supplies the tobacco ash, Brack the resin. But the hand that arranged these things may not be theirs. Before I could answer, a sharp rap at the door heralded Inspector Lestrade. He entered with his usual brisk impatience, hat still damp from the fog. I've had the surgeon's notes, Holmes. Heart gave way, as I told you. Nothing untoward. Holmes took the paper, scanned it, and handed it to me. The report confirmed sudden failure. No visible lesions, no trauma. Only a faint odor about the lips not accounted for. Holmes tapped the margin with one long finger. You see, Watson, the surgeon cannot classify a poison he does not expect. A resinous compound, masked by floral sweetness, would leave no crude stain. It kills in silence. Lestrade frowned. You speak as though you've solved it already. On the contrary, Holmes replied. I speak as though the case has just begun. That evening we dined poorly at Vale's insistence. Neither he nor his household seemed inclined to eat, but Holmes was scarcely aware of his plate. He sat in abstraction, fingers steepled, eyes fixed upon some private constellation. At length he rose, declaring that the time had come to revisit the garden under its natural cloak. The fog had thickened by then, muffling sound and bending the lamps into halos. We carried lanterns, though Holmes kept his shuttered. The garden awaited us like a stage prepared for actors who never came. The roses gleamed in spectral colour, each bloom holding its breath against the night. Holmes moved swiftly, studying the conservatory doors, the path where Lady Charlotte had fallen, the wall gate with its polished hasp. At the base of the gravel, near the very print of her last step, he crouched and drew from the soil a shred no larger than a fingernail. He held it to my lantern, wax, Watson, and not candle wax, but the hardened shell of a sealing preparation. He folded it carefully into his pocketbook. A sound broke the stillness, the faintest scrape of gravel. Holmes's head whipped round, and we saw a figure melt back into shadow by the wall. Holmes sprang with astonishing swiftness, but the intruder had fled before we reached the corner. Only the echo of quick steps along the river path remained. We returned to the house in silence, the roses gleaming behind us like mute conspirators. Holmes, when at last we sat again before the hearth, looked not defeated but alight with grim certainty. We have seen the garden's true master tonight, Watson, he said. Not nature nor mere chance. Someone tends this theatre of bloom with a chemist's hand and a player's cunning. The wax upon the path, the vanished label, the odour, These are threads of the same web. Tomorrow we shall tug them, and the spider will not long remain hidden. The figure who had melted into the fog the previous night remained foremost in my thoughts when Holmes roused me, at an hour I would have called inhospitable even in war. He had slept, if at all, in a chair by the fire, his eyes hollow but his mind alight with the peculiar energy that danger always lent him. Over a breakfast he scarcely touched. He spoke with the precision of a man laying out surgical instruments. "We have two courses, Watson. The first, to trace the stranger of last night, who, I need hardly say, was not a passing vagrant, but one intimately acquainted with that garden. The second, to examine the compound that deceives roses and lungs alike. Each alone tells little. Together they may tell the whole story." By the time Vale joined us, pale from sleepless hours, Holmes had already dispatched a note to his chemical acquaintance at St. Bartholomew's, enclosing the wax scrap and a portion of the resinous grit taken from the conservatory sill. Vale wished to accompany us, but Holmes sent him firmly about his trustee duties. "You will serve us best, sir, by ensuring that every guest from last evening remains within reach of an interview. Too much liberty just now would be most unfortunate." We walked then to the river embankment, where the stranger had escaped. The mud retained traces of hurried flight, a line of impressions running parallel with the wall until they vanished at the wooden jetty. Holmes crouched over one print and measured it against his cane. A small foot, though weighted enough to press the gravel deeply, the sole narrow, the heel sharp. Not a labourer's boot, nor a gentleman's broad tread. He glanced up at me. "You recall Miss Whitfield's shoes. A delicate pair, but no more than a lady's ornament. This is a sturdier make, yet not of a man's. Our visitor last night was a woman. A woman, Holmes, but which? That, my dear fellow, is the playbill we must now study." By late morning we had returned to Greengage House. Lestrade awaited us in a temper, his patience thinned by Holmes's silence of the previous day. "You promised revelations, Mr. Holmes, and all I see are roses and frightened servants. I cannot put a gardener in jail for having clean nails." Holmes ignored the jibe, asking instead whether Lestrade had inquired further into Lady Charlotte's recent purchases. The inspector grunted that he had, and produced from his coat a packet of invoices recovered from a local apothecary. Among them were tinctures of digitalis, laudanum, and several essences more common to varnishers than florists. One item, listed under special order, drew Holmes's long finger to rest. Potassium cyanide, small quantity. "There is our fatal note," he said quietly. "Cyanide has neither taste nor warning, save the almond odor which an untrained nose may mistake for perfume. Dissolved in water, it will kill without bruise or wound. The roses, poor dupes, may drink it as a preservative. A woman of Lady Charlotte's wealth could conceal such an acquisition beneath the veil of horticulture." Lestrade's eyes narrowed. "Then you suggest suicide?" "No," Holmes said firmly. "She valued her curiosities too highly. And the wax upon the path, the vanished label, the prowler, these speak of orchestration. Someone else composed the scene. It was at that moment that Miss Ardenti, the pianist, appeared in the doorway, clearly surprised to find the morning room occupied. She was a handsome woman of Mediterranean bearing, her dress rich but not ostentatious. At sight of Holmes she coloured faintly, as though recalling words spoken in the half-light of last night's road. She begged pardon, saying she sought her gloves, which she must have left after the performance. Holmes rose, bowed with peculiar grace, and asked if she would permit a question. "Did you accompany Mr. Brack some distance upon the road?" She admitted she had, speaking with a warmth that suggested Brack's company was welcome to her. They had parted near the inn where he lodged. She had not returned by the river path, she insisted, but kept to the main road where lamps still burned. Holmes thanked her, his tone so bland that she looked puzzled, then withdrew. When she was gone, Holmes leaned back, eyes gleaming. "Watson, you observe, gloves. She claims to have left them. Yet last night, when I glimpsed the fleeing figure, the hand that steadied itself upon the wall was bare. We may infer our visitor had cause to remove them, or never wore them at all." Before I could reply, the gardener Creer was announced again, this time carrying a small wooden box. He explained that it had been found in the tool shed behind a row of empty pots. Inside lay a cluster of wax-sealed phials, their contents colourless. Holmes took one, held it to the light, and unsealed it with a pin. He dipped the merest corner of his handkerchief and then held it out for me to smell. The odour struck sharp and bitter, unmistakable even to my untrained senses. Cyanide, Holmes confirmed, his voice flat. Creer looked stricken, protesting that he knew nothing of the box. The shed was oft used by the late Lady Charlotte herself, he said, and he had never seen those files. Lestrade would have seized upon him at once, but Holmes restrained the inspector with a glance. Not yet. The hand that hides evidence so clumsily wishes us to find it. That makes the gardener a scapegoat, not a culprit. The afternoon wore on under heavy skies. Holmes paced the conservatory, then the garden, his every movement a calculation. At last he halted before the empty nail where the eternal red label had once hung. He studied it for a long minute, then said softly, "This is our axis. A rose that claims eternity is apt bait for vanity. Someone wished to fix attention here, to clothe their crime in horticultural wonder. Tonight, Watson, we shall wait again, but this time we shall not give chase. We shall watch, as spiders watch their web, and the trembling will reveal who plucks the threads." That night, with Vale's reluctant permission, we concealed ourselves within the conservatory. The fog pressed against the panes, muffling the garden into a stage of shadows. Hours dragged, broken only by the tick of a clock and the faint drip of condensation. Then, close to midnight, the wall gate gave a sound no louder than a sigh. A figure entered, cloaked and deliberate. It moved not to the roses at large, but straight to the vacant spot where the eternal red label had hung. The figure stooped, drew something from its cloak and bent over the soil. Holmes's hand tightened on my arm. Not yet. The lantern we kept shuttered revealed, through its narrow slit, the pale oval of a woman's face beneath the hood. She held a small brush, dipped it into a phial, and stroked the solution upon the petals of a bloom that had been invisible in the fog. The rose gleamed unnaturally in the lantern's slit of light, its color dark as blood. Holmes flung open the shutter. The woman started back, the phial slipping from her hand to shatter on the gravel. The sickly sweet odor rose at once, and in that harsh light we beheld the pale features of Miss Eleanor Whitfield, rigid in the instant before denial could form upon her lips. For the space of a breath, none of us stirred. The phial's acrid perfume hung between us, mingling with the sweetness of the roses until the air itself seemed poisoned by contradiction. Eleanor Whitfield did not attempt flight. She drew herself upright with the rigid composure of a woman raised to endure scrutiny, her dark eyes steady upon Holmes, though her lips trembled. "So, Mr. Holmes," she said at last, in a voice that was more weary than frightened, "you will tell me that you have caught your culprit." Holmes regarded her without triumph, his lantern trained not upon her face, but upon the unnatural bloom at her side, where the crimson seemed to pulse unnaturally in the mist. "Caught? No, Miss Whitfield. A net must first be woven, before one may claim to have caught anything. At present I hold a thread. Whether it binds you or another remains to be proved." Lestrade, who had crouched at the ready, surged forward with all the eagerness of a terrier scenting blood. "I'll take her in custody now, Holmes." "Attempting to destroy evidence—" "No," Holmes interrupted so sharply that the inspector fell back bristling. "We do not arrest shadows. Miss Whitfield, sit." She hesitated, then obeyed, sinking onto a wrought-iron chair that stood half-shrouded in the fog. Her hands rested in her lap, pale against the dark fabric of her cloak, fingers interlaced with the deliberate calm of one who knows panic would be her undoing. Holmes seated himself opposite her, folding long legs beneath him with studied ease. "You returned from Vienna 6 weeks ago," he began softly, as though speaking across a library table, "a city where medicine is studied as an art as well as a science. You spoke yesterday of tutors, physicians. I fancy you are not unacquainted with chemistry." Eleanor inclined her head, the gesture neither admission nor denial. "You also told me," Holmes continued, "that your aunt's heart was troubled. You, better than anyone, would know how delicate that balance was. And you knew, too, what compounds could hasten an end without leaving the brutal marks of violence." Her eyes flashed for the first time. "You accuse me of killing the only relative who treated me with respect, of destroying the very woman who funded my studies, who made it possible for me to escape the stifling parlor tricks expected of my sex." Holmes leaned forward, voice low. "Respect, Miss Whitfield, is not love. Funding is not freedom, and admiration is not inheritance." The silence that followed was like the hush of a theatre when the orchestra holds its breath. Eleanor's gaze did not falter, yet a muscle in her jaw betrayed the effort it cost her. When she spoke, the words came not as confession but as defiance. "My aunt would have left the estate to her charities. She said so often enough. Should that condemn me to dependence? Am I to stand in lecture halls begging stipends from men who smile at a novelty, then send me back to the sewing room when the fashion has passed? Lestrade muttered something about motive and means, already fumbling for his notebook. Holmes lifted a hand to silence him. You prepared your aunt's tonic, did you not? Eleanor's breath caught, only faintly, but enough I suspected as much when I saw the foreign invoice. Holmes went on, his voice calm, inexorable. Digitalis mastic, oil of spike, cyanide. A chemist might order such things for experiment. But a lady of gardens? No. It was your hand that penned that request, and it was your hand that brushed the petals tonight with the same solution, seeking to maintain the illusion of eternal bloom. Eleanor's composure wavered. She half rose, then sat again. If I had wished to poison her, I could have done so a dozen times without subterfuge. Why risk discovery with wax files, with labels, with theatre? Because Holmes said, and here his eyes gleamed with that peculiar fire Watson knew too well, you are not merely a chemist, you are an artist. You wished not only for her death, but for a legend, the roses that never died, the lady who perished among them, a tale fit for parlours and newspapers. And you thought yourself so clever that none would pierce the veil. Her lips parted, and for an instant something almost like admiration flickered there, admiration for the man who had read her design. Then it hardened into disdain. And yet you have no proof, she whispered. Holmes rose. Proof is a matter of patience. The file you dropped tonight, the wax scrap upon the path, the missing label from Eternal Red all speak in chorus. The surgeon's notes will tell us of the faint odor about the lips. And tomorrow, when my chemical friend reports, we shall have the substance itself identified beyond doubt. At that, Eleanor's composure crumbled for the briefest second. Her hands clenched. Her eyes darted to the rose she had painted with poison, as though it might betray her further. But she mastered herself, stood and said with sudden coldness, "Then I shall wait for your proof. Mr. Holmes, until then I am merely a woman mourning her aunt." She swept past us, leaving the conservatory door ajar, her figure swallowed by the fog. Lestrade swore under his breath. "You let her go! She'll be halfway to Dover before dawn." "No," Holmes said, his tone almost languid. "She will not run. To run would be to confess, and she trusts her own cleverness too deeply to yield it so cheaply." We left the garden then, the roses watching like silent jurors. Back in the morning room, Holmes seated himself once more before the tarnished key that hung upon its ribbon. The flame of the lamp caught his features in severe relief. "You see, Watson," he murmured, "it is not enough to show who wielded the poison. We must demonstrate why the play was staged so elaborately, why a simple death was not enough. Until then, the Yard has only suspicion." I asked what he intended. "To set the stage anew," he replied, his voice distant, as though already arranging the scene upon some invisible board. "Tonight she sought to preserve her myth. Tomorrow we shall compel her to betray it. The rose that never dies will yield the truth, and with it, the hand that sought to bind nature to deceit." And with that he closed his eyes, steepled his fingers and sat in silence, while the odor of crushed petals and bitter almonds clung to the air like the memory of a crime not yet fully spoken. Morning found the house in a strange suspension, as if all within it listened for some sound that never came. The servants moved with hushed steps, glancing toward the walled garden as though the roses might summon them. Lestrade, impatient to conclude matters, had stationed a constable at the gate, and yet Holmes seemed in no haste at all. He spent the early hours at the escritoire in Lady Charlotte's morning room, turning over papers with the delicacy of a surgeon probing a wound. I watched him, restless, unable to reconcile the calm of his manner with the gravity of what we had seen the night before. Eleanor Whitfield's pale face, the phial spilling its poison onto the gravel, had burned itself into my memory. I asked him whether it was wise to let her roam free. Holmes replied without looking up. "A bird will fly in circles about its cage long before it strikes the bars. To confine her now would be to spare her the temptation of betraying herself." At noon a message arrived from St. Bartholomew's, carried by a boy who looked relieved to quit the sombre house. Holmes slit the envelope swiftly and read. His eyes sharpened, though he spoke with studied nonchalance. "As expected. Hydrocyanic acid, in quantity sufficient to preserve blossoms for weeks, or to end a life in moments. The residue upon the wax scrap matches precisely." He folded the note. "The instrument is beyond dispute. It remains only to prove the hand. Lestrade, who had been pacing like a man forced to wait through a sermon, seized upon this. Then we have her, Holmes. We have enough to put irons on her wrists. Not enough, Holmes said quietly. Jurors are not chemists, Inspector. They are men with wives, daughters, nieces. They will see a young woman mourning her aunt, and wonder if the yard seeks a scapegoat. No, we must let her condemn herself, and with her, the accomplice who shadows her steps. Accomplice? I echoed, startled. Holmes looked up at me then, and in his grey eyes I saw the outline of a deduction not yet spoken. Think, Watson. The figure we glimpsed in the fog was alone, yes, but the wax upon the path the night of Lady Charlotte's death could not have been placed by her without risk of discovery. Someone unlocked the gate, someone arranged the scene. A woman may wield a brush, but another hand moves the scenery. We had little time to ponder, for Mr. Brack, the violinist, was announced shortly after. He entered with his restless energy, bowing extravagantly to Vale and myself, but throwing Holmes a guarded glance. He claimed he had come to offer condolences, but I suspected curiosity drew him more strongly than grief. Holmes engaged him at once, asking of his lodgings, his habits, his instrument. Brack answered fluently, but when Holmes mentioned the order of gum mastic and oil of spike from Vienna, his fingers twitched upon his coat, as though straying to a bow he had not the courage to draw. "You are careless with your varnishes," Holmes remarked, and rose abruptly. "I should like to examine your violin, if you please." Brack flushed. "It is at my inn. Then you will bring it here by evening." "Until then," Holmes's voice sharpened, "you do not leave Chiswick." Brack's eyes darted to Vale, then to Lestrade, but neither offered him rescue. He bowed again with forced grace and withdrew. As the door closed, Lestrade muttered, "So he's in it too, is he?" Holmes did not answer. He stood at the window, gazing out toward the fog that smothered the river. After a long silence, he said, "Tonight we bring the matter to an end. Miss Whitfield cannot resist the lure of her garden, not while the myth of the eternal rose lies unfinished. She will return to perfect her stage, and Brack, if he is indeed her confederate, will not be far behind. We shall provide them with an audience they do not expect." That evening, by Holmes's design, the household was contrived into quiet seclusion. Vale feigned departure on some business of the trust, while Lestrade and his constable concealed themselves by the wall gate. Holmes and I once more occupied the conservatory, lantern shuttered, the air heavy with damp. Hours passed. I confess my eyes drooped, the silence pressing upon me like a weight. But Holmes never stirred, his gaze fixed upon the shadowed beds, as though the roses themselves whispered their secrets to him. At last, a stir. A soft scrape of metal. The wall gate moved ever so slightly, then closed again. Two figures entered, cloaked against the fog. They moved swiftly, one tall and angular, the other slight. Together they crossed to the vacant nail where the eternal red label had hung. I felt Holmes's grip upon my sleeve. "Now, Watson, watch how vanity betrays itself." The smaller figure knelt Eleanor unmistakably and raised another file. The taller shape bent beside her, shielding the act. Even through the fog I caught the gleam of a violin case slung across his shoulder. Brack Holmes threw the lantern wide. The light blazed across them, and they started like players caught mid-rehearsal. Eleanor sprang up, her face ashen, while Brack's hand darted inside his cloak as though for a weapon. Lestrade burst from the shadows with his constable, seizing the violinist before the movement could be completed. Eleanor's composure shattered at the sight. She cried out, a sound torn between fury and despair, and reached for the poisoned bloom she had painted. But Holmes was swifter. He caught her wrist with a gentleness that belied the iron in his grip. "Enough, Miss Whitfield," he said. "The curtain has fallen." Brack struggled, snarling in broken English, but Lestrade's men had him fast. Eleanor sagged against Holmes's hold, her cloak slipping back to reveal the drawn features of a woman who had played her part too long. "Why?" Vale demanded, stepping forward, his voice hoarse. "For what reason could you do this?" Eleanor's eyes blazed. "For freedom!" she cried. "For a life beyond the parlour, beyond the patronage of old women who think learning a gift to be bestowed at whim. He promised me," she cast a glance at Brack, "that together we would take the estate, the money, the future." Holmes released her wrist, and she sank into the chair, defeated. The roses swayed faintly in the night breeze, as though mocking the frailty of human schemes. "You see, Watson," Holmes said softly, "the eternal rose was never the miracle. It was merely the mask beneath which greed and vanity sought to hide. Nature will not be compelled to err forever. Lestrade led them away at dawn, the fog lifting to reveal the garden in pallid daylight. The blooms still gleamed, beautiful and obscene, each petal touched by the hand of deceit. Holmes stood a long while silent, then turned to me with a tired smile. Another stage dismantled, another play concluded. Come, Watson, the world beyond these walls has need of us. And roses must learn at last to wither in their time. We returned to Baker Street the following afternoon, the fog having lifted to reveal London in its familiar, ungenerous hues. Though Lestrade had gone away with his prisoners and his satisfaction, Holmes remained curiously subdued, as though victory had left him unsated. He sank into his chair, the violin at his elbow untouched, and for a long while the only sound was the scratch of my pen as I tried to set our notes in order. At length, I asked what troubled him. Surely, Holmes, the case is concluded. The niece and her accomplice stand revealed, the poison identified. The Yard will have no difficulty securing a conviction. Holmes closed his eyes and exhaled. Concluded, Watson. No, resolved perhaps, but not concluded. He gestured toward the heap of roses we had brought with us from Greengage House, laid upon a tray for study. Look at them. They are as bright today as when we cut them, though a night has passed. Had she been content to let them wither, Lady Charlotte might yet live. The tragedy is not that Eleanor Whitfield killed her aunt. It is that she believed she had to fashion eternity to be free. He rose, pacing the room. Brack was but a parasite. His motive was crude: money, security, the patronage of a wealthy widow's heir. Eleanor's was more subtle. She was clever enough to pass as an equal among her tutors in Vienna, yet society would have confined her to embroidery and polite recitals. To secure her inheritance, she contrived not merely a death but a myth. She chose to shroud her crime in poetry, and poetry is more dangerous than any blade. I reminded him that whatever her motives, the law must take its course. Holmes nodded, though without conviction. The law, yes, but justice is not always the same measure. He turned suddenly, eyes narrowing. Did you note, Watson, how she spoke in the conservatory? She cried it was for freedom. She believed it too. Such convictions are not uprooted by the mere iron of jail. For days the matter lay thus, neither forgotten nor entirely set aside. Newspapers seized upon the affair with the morbid appetite of the public. The roses of death, Chiswick's garden mystery, poison and passion in a walled paradise. They exaggerated every detail, elevating Eleanor to the status of a dark enchantress, Brack to her sinister accomplice. Holmes read them with a thin smile, remarking that truth once sold at a halfpenny is worth precisely that. It was nearly a week later when a knock came at our door, timid and urgent at once. Mrs. Hudson admitted a young maid in the livery of Greengage House. She trembled as she curtsied, explaining that she had come at Mr. Vale's request. "He begs you, sir," she said to Holmes, "to return once more. There are matters unsettled, and he fears scandal if they are left unattended." Holmes seized his coat at once, a glimmer of his old fire returning. "Watson, the play has another act." We found Vale in the morning room, looking more gaunt than before, his hands stained with ink and his desk littered with correspondence. He greeted us with palpable relief. "Mr. Holmes, I know the law is satisfied. But I beg you, something still troubles me." Holmes listened in silence as Vale explained. Since the arrests he had ordered the garden locked, yet servants whispered of noises by night, of shadows passing along the wall, of a faint odour drifting even through shuttered windows. He himself had gone to the conservatory and found one rose upon the eternal red bush blackened at the edges, as though touched by fire. Yet none had been near it. Holmes examined the letter Vale thrust at him, a note left unsigned, delivered that morning. It contained but a single line: "The roses die at last, and so shall you." Vale's face was pale as he added, "I fear Eleanor had accomplices yet unknown." Holmes's eyes glinted. "Or imitators. A myth once loosed breeds disciples." He folded the note carefully. "You did not publish this?" "No," Vale swore. "Only you know of it. Good. Then we may yet act before the tale grows a new head." Holmes rose abruptly. "You will keep the house guarded but quiet. Allow no rumour to escape. Watson and I will return this evening." That night the fog was thin, the moon a dull coin above the river. We entered the garden once more. the roses standing like sentinels beneath their impossible bloom. Holmes moved swiftly to the eternal red bush. "See, Watson, the edges are indeed blackened, but not by fire." He touched a petal lightly. Some reagent, corrosive in its action. A different hand, a different mind. We searched the beds in silence. Near the potting shed, Holmes stooped and lifted a scrap of cloth rough and work-worn. "Not a lady's handkerchief this time, Watson." He sniffed it and frowned. "Carbolic soap, strong of the sort used in hospitals. A gardener, I ventured, or one who frequents hospitals," Holmes said grimly. "Recall Eleanor studied medicine in Vienna. She was not alone in her lectures. One of her circle may have followed her here." We had no more time for speculation, for even as he spoke, a shadow detached itself from the wall. A man this time, taller, moving with the certainty of one who knew the paths. He approached the eternal red and drew from his coat a vial. The moonlight caught the liquid within, pale and deadly. Holmes whispered, "Not yet." The man stooped, uncorked the vial, and raised it to the rose. In that instant, Holmes sprang, seizing his wrist. The vial fell, shattering upon the gravel. A pungent odor rose, sharper even than before, stinging the eyes. Lestrade's constable, who had kept watch by arrangement, rushed forward to clap irons upon the intruder. The lantern revealed a thin, sallow face, marked with the pallor of long hours indoors. Vale gasped. "That is Pike, the gardener dismissed years ago." "Indeed," Holmes said, eyes glittering. "Curiosity dismissed without character. Yet curiosity seldom dies. He has returned to complete the myth where Eleanor failed." Pike struggled, his voice harsh. "She promised me. She said the roses would make us immortal." "You stopped her, but I will finish it. I alone will be remembered." Holmes regarded him coldly. "No, Pike. What will be remembered is the folly of men and women who sought eternity in blossoms and found only death." The constable led the wretch away, his cries echoing against the garden walls. Holmes turned back to Vale, who stood trembling among the roses. "The danger is ended," he said softly, "but you must see to it that these abominations are destroyed. Let the beds be burned, the soil renewed. Nature must reclaim what deceit has stolen." Vale bowed his head, tears standing in his eyes. "It shall be done." We left Greengage House as dawn broke, the first light catching the poisoned petals until they seemed, for one final moment, to blaze with unnatural splendor. Holmes walked in silence until the cab turned toward Baker Street. Then he spoke almost to himself. "You see, Watson, myths are more perilous than poisons. A man may lock away a vial, but he cannot so easily lock away an idea. That is why we must not only catch criminals, but strip their legends bare, and I, who had seen the roses gleam in the fog like jewels of another world, could not help but shudder, for I knew he spoke the truth. When we returned at last to Baker Street after Pike's arrest, the city had already shaken off the fog, the morning air brisk and unsympathetic to our exhaustion. Holmes cast aside his coat with uncharacteristic weariness and went directly to the mantel, where he stood staring into the cold grate as though the smoke of Greengage House still clung there. I set about making tea, for his pallor told me that even his remarkable constitution had been strained by these days of sleepless vigilance. Yet when I pressed the cup into his hand, he merely nodded and placed it untasted upon the table. "Watson," he said, "the case is a hydra. We cut one head, and two grow in its place. First Eleanor, then Brack, now Pike. What unites them is not merely greed, but the intoxication of myth. The roses became a theatre where each played for immortality, not in life but in memory. Lady Charlotte, I think, never fully grasped what monster she nurtured when she walled that garden. I asked whether he believed the matter now at last resolved. He gave a short, mirthless laugh. Resolved for the Yard, perhaps. They have their culprits in irons, their papers signed. But you and I, Watson, we have seen the deeper truth. A crime once clothed in wonder does not die with the criminal. Already the newspapers fashion her niece into a dark heroine, Pike into a mad disciple. So long as people whisper of roses that never die, the soil remains fertile for imitation. He moved restlessly about the room, fingers brushing the violin case, but never lifting it. Then, with abrupt decision, he rang for a messenger. He penned a note swiftly and sealed it, instructing the boy to deliver it at once to Mr. Vale. Burn the garden without delay. Take not a cutting, not a seed. Ash alone will suffice. The following day, Vale himself appeared, drawn and weary, yet with a look of gratitude. "It is done, Mr. Holmes. The roses are no more. The earth lies black and bare." Holmes inclined his head gravely. "You have saved more than your household, sir. You have prevented a contagion." But Vale did not share his relief. His eyes strayed often to the envelope he carried. At last he placed it upon the table. "One more matter, if I may trouble you." It was a will. Lady Charlotte's last testament, dated scarcely a month before her death. Vale explained that it had been recovered from her solicitor only after her passing. Its provisions startled me. The greater part of her estate indeed to charity, but with a generous legacy to her niece Eleanor, sufficient to support a lifetime of study abroad. Vale's voice shook as he spoke. "You see, Holmes, Eleanor's fears were groundless. She would not have been cast adrift. Had she only waited, her freedom was assured without blood." Holmes's expression hardened. "So often it is, Watson. Impatience is the spur of crime. Men and women will not trust time to deliver what they demand today." Yet even as he spoke, something troubled him. He bent again over the will, examining the hand with his lens. At last he laid it down. Curious. The ink is fresh, yet the strokes are uneven, as though written with an unsteady hand. "I do not say it is forged, but I should like to see earlier specimens for comparison." Vale promised to procure them, though he confessed that Lady Charlotte seldom wrote more than brief notes. When he departed, Holmes fell into one of his long silences, pacing the room as though measuring invisible distances. That evening he spoke. "There is a chord still unresolved, Watson. Eleanor's motive was the inheritance, yet the will grants her security. Brack's motive was money, but a more certain fortune awaited him through her. Pike's motive was curiosity and spite, yet he returned only after her arrest. What binds them together is not only the roses, but knowledge of this document. Someone must have whispered to Eleanor that her aunt meant to disinherit her. That someone either misled her or forged this will after her death. I protested that such deceit was hardly necessary, since she confessed her intentions freely in the garden." Holmes smiled thinly. "Confession is not proof, my dear fellow. A mind such as hers may adopt guilt to preserve the grandeur of her scheme. No, we must be certain." 2 days later, Vale returned with a small bundle of Lady Charlotte's correspondence, letters to charities, invitations, brief replies. Holmes compared them line by line against the testament. At last he straightened. "The strokes differ. Observe the loop of the L in her name here, round and fluent. In the will it is jagged, halting. The forger attempted to mimic her style, but habit betrays them." "Then the will is false," I exclaimed. "But who would gain?" Holmes's gaze darkened. "Vale himself manages the charitable trust. By diverting the principal estate, he ensures his own authority. Yet I do not leap to accuse. We must test it." That evening he summoned Vale under pretext of requiring further details. As we sat, Holmes laid the forged will upon the table beside the genuine letters. He said nothing, only invited Vale to compare them. The man's composure faltered. His fingers twitched, his gaze avoided ours. At last he murmured, "Surely such small variations prove nothing." "On the contrary," Holmes said, "they prove motive, where before we had only madness. Eleanor may have acted upon belief, but belief requires a whisperer. Who better than her guardian, the trustee who stood to gain most from her disinheritance? You did not intend her to kill, Mr. Vale. You only meant to frighten her into action that would secure her removal. But the game you played was with loaded dice, and the death of Lady Charlotte was the inevitable throw." Vale's face drained of colour. He rose as though to protest, but Holmes's quiet authority held him pinned. At last he sank back, head in his hands. "I never wished her dead," he whispered. "Only to secure the estate for the charities. She was stubborn, secretive, she would not listen. I told Eleanor her aunt meant to cut her off. I thought only to provoke resentment, not murder." Holmes's eyes were cold. "Intent does not absolve consequence. You forged the will, you sowed the seed, and Eleanor watered it with poison. Between you both, Lady Charlotte is in her grave. Vale was not arrested then." Holmes handed the matter to Lestrade with his usual detachment. Whether the law would treat forgery and manipulation with severity equal to poison, I cannot say. But when the man left our rooms bent and broken, I saw in Holmes's face not triumph but weariness. "You see, Watson," he said softly, "the garden where roses never died was only the stage. The true hothouse lay in human hearts, where pride, impatience, and ambition flourish beyond season. And unlike roses, such growths do not wither with the frost. They must be cut at the root, else they bloom again, more poisonous than before. And I knew as I looked upon the bundle of false papers and the fading roses upon our tray, that Holmes had plucked the final petal from a mystery whose roots ran deeper than any garden wall. Holmes did not at once speak further of Vale after that night, though I knew the matter pressed upon his mind as heavily as the smoke of the city presses upon its streets. He resumed his customary habits with a show of nonchalance, alternating between his violin and his chemical experiments, yet there was an undercurrent of restlessness I had come to recognize as the mark of unfinished business. It was not until 3 evenings later, as the wind rattled the windows of Baker Street, that he returned to the subject without preamble. You observed, Watson, how swiftly Vale yielded when confronted. That was not merely guilt but relief. He wished to be found out. I asked why a man who had profited from forgery should welcome discovery. Holmes smiled faintly. Because he feared a darker shadow. If Vale were the principal hand, he would have prepared defenses, excuses, documents. Instead, he collapsed at the first touch. That tells me his forgery was the act of a man already ensnared by another's will. You suspect yet another accomplice, I said, dismayed at the thought. Not an accomplice, Holmes corrected. A master. There is a hand still hidden, Watson, and it is more skilled than any we have yet faced. Before I could press him, Mrs. Hudson brought up a card, Inspector Lestrade, impatient as always. He entered with brisk steps, shaking the rain from his coat. Holmes, he said, you will not believe this, but Pike has been found dead in his cell, a vial concealed in his boot. Cyanide again. Holmes's eyes narrowed, though he betrayed no surprise. The Roses claim another disciple. Did Pike speak before his death? Lestrade shook his head. Only raved about immortality. The jailers swear they searched him, but the vial was hidden in the heel of his boot, hollowed out and resealed. Ingenious, if you admire such things. Holmes paced the room, hands behind his back. Curious. Pike lacked the wit to fashion such concealment. Someone supplied him, perhaps even encouraged him to silence himself. The question is, who profits by his death? Lestrade muttered about tying loose ends, but Holmes dismissed him with a wave. Keep close watch on Vale, he said. The man is weak, and weakness invites manipulation. After Lestrade's departure, Holmes resumed his pacing, the floorboards creaking beneath his quick steps. Consider, Watson, the pattern. Eleanor sought freedom. Brack sought fortune. Pike sought notoriety. Vale sought influence cloaked in philanthropy. 4 motives, yet none sufficient to account for the orchestration we have witnessed. And now Pike silenced in jail. There is a 5th voice, one we have not yet heard. It was the following morning when the final note arrived. I was at breakfast when Holmes slit the envelope, his face sharpening as he read. He passed it across to me without comment. The hand was elegant, the phrasing precise. The garden has been pruned, but its root remains. Seek it in Vienna, where the roses first learned to outlast their season. There was no signature, Vienna, I repeated aloud. The city of Eleanor's studies, precisely, Holmes said. She did not contrive her methods alone. There was a tutor, a chemist, perhaps more. This correspondent reminds us that the stage we dismantled in Chiswick was but an outpost. The original theatre lies abroad. I asked if he meant to pursue it, half dreading the answer. Holmes's expression held that gleam which no fatigue could dim. To leave such a seed unexamined would be folly. If roses may never die, neither do the ambitions of men. Pack lightly, Watson. The continent calls. We departed within 2 days, the channel crossing bleak and wet, the train pressing eastward through grey plains, until at last Vienna unfolded before us, with its grand facades and restless crowds. The city was a mixture of old empire and modern science, its streets alive with scholars, musicians, and students who debated fiercely in the cafes. Holmes, with his usual swiftness, traced Eleanor's steps through her former lodgings, the medical lecture halls and the apothecaries that supplied her. At each turn a name surfaced, murmured with respect or unease, Dr. Heinrich Moser, a lecturer in toxicology, and an eccentric known for experiments upon plants as well as animals. Holmes and I visited the university where Moser had taught. Thay Porter, eager for a coin, told us the man had resigned his post the previous year, retreating to a private laboratory on the city's outskirts. There he continued his work, often visited by foreign pupils who whispered of unorthodox theories. One, the porter said, was a young Englishwoman, Miss Whitfield. That evening we traced the address, a house set back from the road behind high iron gates. Through the winter-bare branches we glimpsed glasshouses gleaming faintly, their panes lit from within by the steady glow of lamps. Even at a distance I caught the sickly sweetness upon the air, unmistakable now to my senses. Holmes regarded the place with narrowed eyes. "You see, Watson, the myth was cultivated here long before it bloomed in Chiswick. Lady Charlotte's garden was but a reflection, a vanity imported from these hothouses. If we are to cut at the root, it lies behind those walls." I asked what he proposed. He smiled, thin and dangerous. "We shall call upon Dr. Moser, as travellers interested in his botanical marvels. Let us see whether he greets us with roses or with thorns." The following day we presented ourselves at the gates, Holmes in the guise of an English dilettante, seeking exotic specimens, myself his medical companion. A servant admitted us reluctantly, leading us through a hall lined with cabinets of jars, each containing preserved blossoms floating in pale liquid. The air was heavy with resin and decay. Dr. Moser received us in a chamber that was half study, half laboratory. He was tall, stooped, with a scholar's pallor and eyes that gleamed unnervingly bright. He welcomed us in fluent English, though his tone was clipped as though weighing each word. "You are admirers of my work," he said, and gestured to a table upon which lay a rose as vivid as any June flower, though the snow lay deep outside. It was unnaturally still, its petals gleaming with a sheen that spoke of artifice. Holmes inclined his head with courtesy, though I recognized the predator beneath it. "A marvel indeed, Doctor, a rose that defies time. But tell me, at what cost?" Moser's thin smile deepened. "At the cost of discovery, sir. All progress demands it. These roses will adorn kings' palaces when we are dust. They will outlast dynasties, and perhaps lives," Holmes murmured. The doctor's eyes flickered, but he said nothing more. We took our leave after polite conversation, yet as we departed, I saw Holmes's face settle into the hard lines I knew well. "We are nearer the truth, Watson," he said, as we walked back into the crowded streets. "This man is no mere eccentric. He is the architect of the myth itself. Eleanor was but his disciple. Vale, Brack, Pike, all pawns upon his board. And if he has his way, the world will see roses that never die, and with them crimes that never fade." His hand tightened on my arm. "Tonight we return, and this time, Watson, we shall not go as admirers. We shall go as executioners of illusion." The streets of Vienna lay muffled in snow that night, the gas lamps haloed in mist, as Holmes and I made our way once more toward Dr. Moser's house. Holmes spoke little, his face withdrawn into that mask of abstraction I had learned to interpret as the prelude to decisive action. When at last he did speak, it was in a low voice, each word weighed. "We are not here to gather curiosities, Watson. We are here to end a masquerade. The roses are not mere plants. They are instruments, weapons, bait for weaker souls. If Moser is left unchecked, others will bloom where Eleanor failed." I asked what precisely he intended. Holmes's eyes glinted in the lamplight. "To force his hand, my dear fellow. The man hides behind scholarship. We must strip away the lecture robes and expose the chemist who toys with life and death." We reached the gate and found it unguarded, the snow crisp with only a single set of footprints leading inward. Holmes motioned me to silence, and together we followed them until the glow of the glass houses emerged, warm against the winter night. From within came the steady hum of a lamp and the faint chime of glass upon glass. Holmes drew me toward a side entrance, and we slipped inside. The air struck me at once, thick, sweet, cloying. The roses, dozens of them, glimmered unnaturally in rows beneath the lamps. Their colors were too vivid, their petals stiff as enamel. No insect moved among them, no breath of natural growth. It was a gallery of simulacra, each more unsettling than the last. At the far end, Dr. Moser bent over a bench, his long hands steady as he poured liquid from one vessel to another. He did not start when Holmes spoke, though the voice must have startled him. "Late hour for gardening, Doctor." Moser straightened, turning toward us with unhurried composure. His eyes, bright as steel, flicked between us. "I expected you." "The English are not subtle when they feign admiration." Holmes advanced, his step silent upon the damp floor. "Then you know why we are here. The garden in Chiswick was your design, the poison your doctrine. Eleanor Whitfield was your disciple. Moser inclined his head faintly, as though acknowledging an academic citation. She had promise more than most, but she lacked patience. The plant thrives only when tended with devotion. She rushed, and so the bloom withered into scandal. She poisoned her aunt, Holmes said sharply, and others followed, Brack, Pike, driven by greed and delusion. That is the harvest of your teaching. The doctor's smile was thin. Every discovery has casualties. Will you condemn Pasteur for the deaths of his test animals? Or Jenner for the fevers of his early trials? Progress is written in blood. Holmes's voice cut through the perfumed air like a blade. Do not mistake butchery for progress, Doctor. You have not preserved roses. You have embalmed them. And with them, you have embalmed the hearts of those foolish enough to believe in eternity. For the first time I saw a flicker in Moser's composure, the faintest tightening at the corners of his mouth. You are a man of logic, Mr. Holmes, yet even you cannot deny the appeal of what I have made. Men will pay fortunes for flowers that do not fade. Women will barter freedom for petals that never fall. Kingdoms will adorn themselves with blossoms that mock time. That is power. Holmes drew closer until only the bench separated them. And yet you hide here, in a glasshouse at the edge of Vienna, whispering to pupils and pawns. If power were yours, you would not need disciples to carry it to England. You would not need to cloak yourself in secrecy. Moser's hand shifted toward a drawer. Holmes saw it at once and seized his wrist with sudden violence. The drawer clattered open, revealing a vial of the same pale liquid I had smelled too often. Moser struggled, his stooped frame surprisingly strong, but Holmes wrenched the vial free and hurled it against the stone floor. It shattered, the acrid odor filling the air. Enough, Holmes said. You will answer not in laboratories, but in courts. But Moser only laughed softly, the sound more chilling than any outburst. Courts? You think the Austrian authorities care for a few English deaths? They have already tasted my roses at imperial banquets. They will not silence me. Holmes's grip did not falter, though his eyes flicked toward me. Watson, the lamp. Quickly I obeyed, taking up the lantern Holmes indicated. He forced Moser back from the bench, his tone cold as ice. You speak of immortality, Doctor, yet your work is as fragile as glass. One flame and your myth crumbles into smoke. For the first time, genuine alarm crossed Moser's features. He struggled, then stilled, reading the resolve in Holmes's eyes. You would not. Years of study, decades of toil. Holmes's voice cut him short. Better ashes than victims. With that, he thrust the lantern toward the nearest bench. At once the vapors caught, a tongue of fire licking along the row of files. Moser cried out, but Holmes pulled him back, his long arm iron around the man's chest. The flames leapt swiftly, devouring the resinous fumes, and within moments the glass house was an inferno. Roses blackened and curled, their colors melting into smoke. We dragged Moser bodily into the snow outside, where he collapsed, gasping, his fury spent in a shuddering silence. The fire roared behind us, the panes shattering one by one until the night rang with the sound of breaking glass. Holmes stood over him, his face illuminated by the blaze. You sought eternity in petals, Doctor, but all you have left is ash. The authorities arrived before dawn, summoned by the fire's glow. They took Moser into custody, though whether they truly understood the scope of his crimes I cannot say. Holmes gave his statement with cold precision, demanding only that the laboratory be reduced to rubble and the ashes buried deep. When at last we returned to our lodgings, exhausted and blackened with smoke, Holmes sank into a chair with a weariness I had rarely seen. Yet in his eyes there burned a satisfaction deeper than triumph. We have cut the root, Watson. The garden in Chiswick was but a branch. Now the tree itself is felled, and as the first pale light of dawn crept across Vienna's rooftops, I thought of the roses that never died, now turned at last to smoke drifting into the winter sky, and I felt a quiet gratitude that Holmes had once again stripped illusion bare to reveal the mortal truth beneath. The journey back to London was marked by a silence neither oppressive nor uneasy, but reflective, the silence of men who have stared too long into artifice, and returned with the certainty that truth, however bitter, is the safer companion. Holmes kept to his corner of the carriage, the smoke of his pipe curling faintly against the window as the landscape fled by. At last he spoke, not to me but as though addressing the air. We are apt, Watson, to imagine crime as sudden, A pistol fired, a jewel stolen, a throat cut in anger. Yet the deadliest crimes are those that unfold like seasons, cultivated with patience until their harvest seems inevitable. Lady Charlotte's garden was never about roses. It was about the illusion of permanence, and that illusion proved more intoxicating than any opiate. I replied that Moser, Eleanor, Brack, Pike, and Vale had each sought their own version of that illusion. Wealth, freedom, notoriety, influence. Holmes inclined his head. Precisely. Each clutched at eternity and in so doing lost the present. And he drew upon his pipe with a faint wintry smile, we are left to remind the world that roses, like men, are meant to wither. Without that certainty, life ceases to have meaning. Back in Baker Street, the newspapers had already seized upon the story, though stripped of its true depth. Viennese chemist exposed, poison gardens destroyed, the mystery of the immortal rose concluded. Holmes read them with his habitual disdain, tossing one aside after another. He muttered that the press prefers romance to truth, for romance sells while truth only instructs. Yet I saw in his eyes that he was not entirely displeased. For all their sensationalism, the world now knew that the roses were ashes, their myth dismantled. Some weeks later, Lestrade called upon us, flushed with the satisfaction of a man whose department has secured both notoriety and apparent success. Eleanor and Brack had been condemned, Vale disgraced, Pike's suicide already half forgotten. Moser, handed over to the Austrian authorities, faced trial not for murder, but for fraud and malpractice. The inspector declared that the Yard was content. Holmes merely smiled thinly, remarking that the Yard often confuses the pruning of branches with the felling of roots. When Lestrade had gone, I ventured that justice, though imperfect, had been done. Holmes rose, restless, and stood by the window, where the fog lay thick upon the street. Justice, Watson, is not always the verdict of courts. It is the preservation of truth against delusion. The danger of Moser's roses was not their poison, but their promise. They offered permanence where none exists. That promise is gone now, consigned to ash. I left him to his thoughts. Yet as I set my notes in order, I realized the tale was not merely of crime and punishment, but of temptation and folly, the folly of believing that life can be preserved in glass or power secured in petals. And as I glanced toward Holmes, silhouetted against the shifting fog, I felt again that blend of awe and melancholy which he so often inspired, awe at his brilliance, melancholy at the truth that such brilliance could never entirely dispel the shadows it revealed. Thus ended the case of the garden, where roses never died. It left behind no eternal blossoms, only lessons etched into memory, that myths can enslave, that ambition can corrupt, and that the keen eye of Sherlock Holmes will always pierce the veil, however artfully it is drawn. And though London's streets remained as grimy and transient as ever, I found a strange comfort in that very transience, for it is in the knowledge that all things fade that life retains its worth.